All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our HR Service Delivery Academy session for the month of November. Our topic for today is internationalization and localization, which I know is a really big topic, and I'm looking forward to today. Before we get started, I did want to cover what to expect in terms of Q&A. We are going to handle Q&A a little bit differently than how we have in the past if you are a regular Academy user. You'll still want to use the Zoom Q&A panel or the YouTube chat to submit your questions, but what we'll be doing today is pausing periodically and answering those questions live. So again, if you do have a question, put it in the Q&A or the YouTube chat, and we'll be reviewing those live throughout today's session. And for today, I am Allison. I will be your host. Many of you have probably heard my voice if you've been on previous HR Service Delivery Academy sessions. Today, I'm happy to announce that we actually have a special guest speaker who will be leading. That will be Alex Coop. He is a leader on the ServiceNow side who really knows a lot about today's topic. So I'm excited to have him on. And actually, what I'm going to do is pass it right over to him to have him introduce himself and dive into today's topic. So Alex, over to you.
Cool. Thank you, Allison. Okay, so let me share my screen. Is that all working? We good?
Yep, it looks good.
Fantastic. Okay, so everybody, my name's Alex Coop. I am the Director of Globalization Deployment here at ServiceNow. I sit in our internationalization team. We own the 22 language packs for all of the platform, the plugins, and the store apps. My history is essentially, I've been in the company for nearly 2 years, but before that, I used to be a solution architect, and I've been doing that for very nearly 10 years now. And over that time, I've spent a lot of implementations, if you will, to focus on multilingual, multinational implementations. So before we continue, I'm going to have to obviously safe harbor this just because it's the usual side of things, but let's get into it. So why would we do localization? Okay, we have to think about what it takes and the reasons and the business purposes. So the first questions and the first things that we need to cover is the why. Then we'll need to think about the what. Then we'll need to think about the how. And then we'll need to think about what does it all take to manage. And then are there any lessons learned or any concepts that we can apply to make things a little bit simpler? Okay. So before I get into any of the little nuances, any of the little details, we have a little poll for you because I'm curious to see how far or where you are in your journey. Nothing super special, nothing to say it's going to go anywhere in particular, but it's just to find out, are any of you in the process of using languages other than English, or are you, oh wow, I'm just looking at the results and I just realized my camera's not on. So hello everybody. So let's have a look. Interesting. Okay, fantastic. So thank you for that. And just for the recording's sake, it seems an over majority of yes, you are, which is awesome. Right. Okay, so let's get through some of the high level information first, because we have to treat what we're going to go through essentially for people who have different levels of information, different levels of knowledge. So let's start from the beginning. Let's get through some terms, and then we can go through the next steps. So we have to go through some very high level terms and what they mean. So the first term we're going to go through, just for those who don't know, is internationalization. And that's the idea of a concept of a process or application being able to suitably work with it without any dependencies of a language. Okay, so could it work in English? Could it work in French? Could it work in Spanish, and so on and so forth? Okay, so at this point, we've not talked about languages. We're just saying on technically functional level, could whatever X be, could it work? So the next part is the localization. This is the concept of adding any visual specificity. So that could be something like a date format, that could be a currency, that could be any other thing that's specific to an area or a given locational need. Okay. And the next one that we're going to go through is translation. So the big topic is always, how do we do the act of translation? There's different strategies involved with that. You can use machine translation, which we'll cover later, and you can use people as well, people translators as well. And then the bit that I look after for you guys, because I help empower our customers and our implementation partners, the idea of globalization, which is a bit of an umbrella term for all of the stuff that you see here. So it's ensuring that every little piece and every little nuance can interconnect as it needs to. Okay, so what you'll also notice, any of the keen eyes amongst you, is each of these has a shortened prefix. Okay, and so for those who don't know, they're actually the first letter of the word in English, followed by the last letter of the word in English, and then counting the number of digits in between them. So if you needed to talk about internationalization, you could sometimes see it referred to as I-18N. Localization could be referred to as L10N, and so on and so forth. Now, this also expands out, and this isn't just a ServiceNow term, this is an industry term. You can also have that in accessibility because it's sometimes referred to as A11Y, for example. So let's go through some high-level concepts within the platform. The first one being the platform has many different functionalities and capabilities. So the first one that we always have to remember is we do localization, right? Not just us, but yourselves when you're building out functionalities for experiences, right? And those experiences could be to do with the desktop side of things. They could be to do with mobiles, the apps, those kinds of things, or anything else like a report or anything along those lines, right? But then we also do it for the interactions. So it could be to do with emails, it could be to do with chat, it could do with user interactions and all those kinds of things. So think of like a portal, that kind of thing. But then at the same time, I like to try and rationalize all these capabilities into the building blocks that make up the portals and make up the forms and the fields and the workflows and all those kind of things. So the idea here is to say a field is a field, right? It doesn't matter if it's in a custom app. It doesn't matter if it's in a CSM workflow or HR workflow or an IT workflow or a widget on a portal. It doesn't matter if it's in the IT service portal. It doesn't matter if it's in the HR portal or a CSM portal or a custom side of things. They're still a widget, they're still fields, right? So they're still following the same concepts and they are essentially the same components. So then before we get into the right-hand side, which I'll go through in a minute, we can also bear in mind that we have a functionality called dynamic translation. So for certain scenarios and certain use cases, we can actually go through the idea of saying, do we want to translate a knowledge article as a first pass through Google or IBM or Microsoft Azure, those kinds of things? Or do we want to hold a real-time agent chat between two people who speak different languages? Then we could do that through dynamic translation, okay? And then beyond that, we obviously do all the actual platform level translations. Like I said, whether it's for a workflow, doesn't really matter what the use case is. Whether it's for a mobile app, doesn't really matter what the use case is. Whether it's for a portal, again, doesn't really matter what the use case is. And the workspaces and the forms that people can interact with. So all of that said and done, we own, as I said earlier, the 22 language packs, and these are those languages that we offer on the right-hand side here. But it doesn't mean that you can't add to that. Okay, so there's no technical limitation to say, oh, we can't add another language like Bahasa Malay or Vietnamese or anything along those lines. You absolutely can, and we'll touch on some of that a bit later. But it's just to say, for those who don't know, these are the 22 language packs that we have available, and they cover all of the UI translations across all of the platform and all of the plugins that it entails. So, and apologies, I'm just turning my head so I can keep a quick eye on the chat as well. So feel free to ask any questions if there's anything that you guys don't understand, or if you need me to explain anything further, that's absolutely fine. Okay, so now that we know that the platform has these technical capabilities and we know that we can, at a very high level, do certain things, we need to start thinking about certain linguistical considerations, okay? So the first thing we need to think about is languages themselves are not equal. So let's have a very quick look at this. I'm not going to dwell too much on it because I'm very conscious of the time, but let's have a quick look. We can use an example of English and we can say, okay, there are different terms depending on which version of English that you're looking at. So we can say in the US, the side of a road is called a sidewalk. In the UK, it's called a pavement, or the box that carries people up different floors in a building. In the US, it's called an elevator. In the UK, it's called a lift. Okay, so that's one concept. The other concept could be the same word with a different meaning. So in America, for instance, a chip could be a snack or crisp. In the UK, it's a thicker French fry like my size of my finger. Or we could have a couple in the US might mean a few in certain areas, whereas a couple over here means strictly two. And then we can also get into pronunciations, but that's not really an issue that we need to concern ourselves because we're more about the reading side of things. But the takeaway here is to say, if we're going to localize the instance and the platform, then it needs to be as approachable and as personalized for the user experience as possible. Okay, so we need to make it resonate with the intended audience as much as we can. So there are a few other considerations to think about, and this will become more apparent as we go through certain things and some of those lessons learned in the industry and best practices and the reasons behind them. But it can also imply things like the way that the verb structures are, the ends of spellings, or the actual word being used in different ways, or even colors as well. So for instance, we could be very careful with that. And potentially, if you're going to use imagery, that could also be another thing that needs to be thought about. And when it comes to some of the technical considerations, we need to also bear in mind the actual sentence structure, because what might seem really easy and really quick and very simple to do in English terms, it may not necessarily be true in other languages. So there are many different considerations that we need to think about. So we've had a quick look at some of these linguistical considerations. That's fine. Now let's have a look at some of the other considerations. So if you're going to be doing a big global side of things and you're going to look at all the different countries and how they might need to interact with you, it may also bear in mind thinking about the location of the instance as well. It's not to say you have to by any stretch of the imagination, but obviously being accessible through the public internet up to the instance, unless you're an on-prem or any other side of things in that private sector side of things, then we can think about where the instance is, right? So if the organization has, presence in America, presence in Europe, and potentially presence in APJ as an example, it may be sensible, just as a testing side of things, to consider the instance be hosted in Europe if allowed to. But the idea there is to say whatever is the least distant, should we say, from the end users for the vast majority. And you can do a pros and cons analysis to work out what's going to make it equal access for everybody for that given audience or user base. So the idea here is to say, generally speaking, the amount of latency between the East Coast and US to Europe is about 150 milliseconds. But then again, from Australia up to Europe or even to the US, it could be as much as over a second. So just something to bear in mind. Okay, and just to highlight, we have a ton of material available now. So we have product documentation, we have guidelines on the developer portal, we have our own community forum, and we have a whole training path as well. So if any of you want to go through in more detail any of the stuff that I'm going to go through today, feel free to check out that localization expert series. All the material we're talking about today is actually included in there, and some of it goes into a lot more detail. But let's get into this. So I'm just going to pause for a split second and check to see if anyone's got any questions. By all means, ask away. If you don't want to, that's absolutely fine. Don't feel you have to. Just know that the option's there.
No questions so far, just a compliment on one of your slides. So it looks like we're caught up for now.
Nice, nice. Okay, so let's think about why we would want to provide languages other than English, okay? So nearly always they're going to be down to the business perspectives, okay? So whether it's to improve engagement so that CSAT can improve, or whether we want to improve usability for SLA reasons, either internally, externally, doesn't really matter. Improve capability for servicing, that's also another big one. Measure a business outcome, whether it can be tied to a particular area, that's also another one. Or maybe you just want to measure a business and customer benefit for maybe less repeated interactions. That's always another big one. And it's not to say this list is exhaustive. These are just very high level examples to show what the kind of things are that you need to be thinking about. So the idea here is to say we always want to improve engagement, we always want to improve usability, therefore we always want to look at the capability of what we can deliver as part of our service offering, and therefore the outcome needs to be a positive change and the benefit needs to be a positive change, because otherwise it's not really going to be serving its intended purpose, okay? So with the why out of the way, let's think about for what. So we can have a look at something like for engagement, a portal, the knowledge content if we want to go down that route. And if we're looking at the portal, there are certain objectives that we want to look at. There are certain areas and considerations that we'll need to think about, certain project side of things that we need to think about. And that's fine, but they do need to be thought about. So then we can look at capabilities as well for the back-end side of things. Which interface are we going to be looking at? Is it UI 16? Is it Workspace? Is it both? All these different things to really understand. And then with that back-end side of things, do we also need to translate or cover any of the supporting material, right? So do the agents need their SOPs to be translated, or all of those other things to go with it? So if we were to look at Workspace and Portal together, are there correlations that we can look at? Are there different considerations, or are there repeatable considerations? So it's just to say, how can we make sure that everything that we need, we already are aware of before we undertake what we want to undertake? So how can we do this? Very high level, for an end user, we want to think about the entire portal experience if we were going to do a portal. It doesn't matter which portal, it could be HR, it could be CSM, it could be Service Portal IT. This is the old IT portal. Obviously, we've launched the new ESC portal, so I should really update this slide. But the idea here is to say any user experience that is meaningful to our target audience should be considered. So menus, the catalog, any of the content that they're going to consume, potentially an announcement that might be shown on the portal, those kinds of things. And it starts opening up all sorts of interesting opportunities that you can look at. If you're going to go down the knowledge content, there are advanced features that we can do. There's particular designs of knowledge bases, which we'll touch on in a bit. But the idea is to think if an end user can access content through a portal, should that also be in the scope that you want to translate? And obviously, if it's the back end, which is the interface, what are their interaction points? How can we make it as efficient for them as possible? It's not to say you have to do any of this, but at least at the end of the day, if you have the awareness of what that might need, then you can have the best informed decision of what you want to do. So then we can start thinking about when and how long it will take. If we know the kind of scope ideas that we want to do, what would that look like? So the first thing we need to do, like we've just said, is cover some decisions. Okay, these are the big ones. The first one I would always recommend is deciding what languages that you want to cover. So is it one language? Is it two languages? Is it 3, 4, 5, 10? Up to you guys, right? That's the purpose of it. And when you've decided the language scope, you can then work out that user experience scope, because it's all about the user experience. That's the whole reason that we would want to do this. So the user experience scope, like I said, could either be the front end, it could be the back end, it could be all the interaction points. Completely up to you guys, but at least that way you can create milestones within your project of how you want to do this. And then you'll need to make some decisions as to which strategy of the translation that you want to go. So if you can make that decision early enough, then it means that you can plan around how you want that to work. So just for those who don't know, there are different ways that you can do translation. There's the machine translation option. So whether you use a cloud provider or whether you use a specialist team or whether you have an in-house, completely up to you. And then there's also human translators. And that's the idea of using language specialist SMEs, ideally in country and ideally with some of the subject matter expertise so that they can correlate certain translation needs. We'll talk more about that in a bit. But the idea is to have that translation strategy defined as early as possible, because if later on you suddenly think that you want to add an extra language and you're later on in the process, would you need to define any of those consequential needs later, and could that cause a delay in what you intended to do? So it's best to get those as early as possible. The next step would be the identification stage to say, okay, we know what we want to do. We've decided all of those things. What do we have that needs to be translated? So if you look at a knowledge base, have we recently done an audit on all of our content, right? Do we know all of the material? Does it need to refresh? Does it need to be updated? Is it still relevant? You know, all those kinds of things. You could apply that same logic to a catalog. You could apply that same logic to the actual interface itself. Have you got a dependency weighting, as in the next future release of something? All these different things. It's about getting your eggs lined up, eggs in one basket, and lining everything up as you need to. And then making sure that you have all the necessary stakeholders, the personas, all the leads, the testers, everything aware of what you want to do, having them lined up in terms of calendars, you know, all those kinds of things. And then the next step would typically be to action it, right? So we'll talk about language leads in a bit, but the high level idea there is to say those people, whoever they are, they own or essentially police the quality of the language that you want to do. So they would define typically style guides. How do you want the tonality? How do you want the intonations of that language to come across as polite or a little bit pushy or whatever it needs to be? And they'll also try and correlate what's called a glossary, which is defining terms of key phrases for consistency reasons for that user experience to be the same across all the translations, right? So are they using the same word for case, or are they using the same word for incident, or are they using the same word for a business term that you guys may use that no one else would necessarily understand to translate because they're not aware of that context? So you could think of acronyms, you can think of synonyms, you know, all those kinds of things. And then the idea is everybody is aligned to what you're trying to do, right? You have a per language test plan because you'll need to test those user experiences in other languages. If there's any third parties, have they been actioned? Are they all set up and lined up? Have all build activities been aligned up? And have you got all of your data ready for what you want to do? Okay. So then if you're going to be building anything, so think of a catalog, think of any particular processes, you want to test that in English, functionally test it in English, because the platform itself is built in English. So if you can prove that it functionally works as intended, you then want to have a separate user experience testing in the language of your intended target audience, right? Because then you can say, okay, well, we know the functionality works. That's one thing. The next step is to say, does it present well? Does it make sense? So if we have a catalog item, does it read well? Does the UI behave as we intend it to? There's no truncation of any of the text. There's no overlapping of any verbiage. It's all behaving and it's all looking as it should, and it's not looking compressed, or it's finishing up with the ellipses of 3 dots, you know, all those kinds of things. And you should allow within your project timeline a certain amount of time per language to test all those different user experiences, because you don't want to find on go live day that something's not quite as you expected because it wasn't tested. So it's always good to test. Okay, so when we've got all of these ideas that we've gone through and we've really thought about them, we can start to put together a very high level roadmap plan of what we want to do. Okay, and it's not to say you have to do this. This is just an idea. It's just to say these are the kind of concepts that you want to think about. We have our scope. That's obviously at the beginning. We have that identification stage. It's obviously quite early on. Then we want to review what we have. We want to come up with a solution design. We want to review that solution design, which will then allow us to build it once it's approved. The content has been reviewed and approved. The testing happens for the functional side of things, and then we have our language testing, and then we can have our go live when we feel happy that everything's been achieved and it's all working as expected, which is fantastic. So that's great. Now let's have a look at if we use one of the cloud-based MTs, machine translations, when it's not trained, right? And then we can see why we would suggest to have this separate testing. So this is a completely fictional scenario, and we have a sentence here that we've put into Japanese, and the intended meaning is to say, hi, when will my case be updated? Okay, but literally in Japanese, when you convert that back into English, it would say, hi, by when it will be updated in my case. So you can kind of get the understanding, that's fine, but this is a very exaggerated example. But you can imagine if we had this come back from Google, the first one is Google, completely untrained, and it says, hello, do you updated, when will my case with a capital W? That's not great. And if we go to Microsoft Azure, we can say, hello, when it will be updated in my case. That's not great either. Okay, and there are plenty of other MTs out there, but it's just to set an expectation that these cloud MTs are great and all. They're fantastic for conversational side of translations, but they're not necessarily so great for specific documentation types or specific UI side of things, because they lack all the context that humans have, right? So what we'd normally recommend, an industry best practice would also recommend, is there should be a language lead that defines all of those concepts for you. Like I said, the style guides, the glossaries of terms, making sure that there's the right consistency, the right tonality of how your translations need to be. So it's not to say that they're doing all of the translations, it's like they're defining the governance rules of those translations, if that makes sense. Okay, so just super quick question. Is everybody following? By all means, just ping me on the chat, that's absolutely fine, or ping Alison, that's absolutely fine. I just want to make sure that we're not losing anybody, because there's a lot that we need to get through.
No questions coming in so far, but I'm keeping my eyes peeled, and our number of attendees is staying consistent. So that's a good sign. People are listening.
Brilliant. Okay, so we're going to come back to this slide a bit later in a bit more detail, but think of the idea as saying, for this, whatever the project is, it could be the knowledge base, it could be user interface or an app, it doesn't really matter. Eventually, you're going to have some key decision makers, you're going to have a technical work stream, and you're going to have a language work stream, essentially. Somebody who's a language lead, either one language or two languages, they'll wear hats. Depending on the size of the project, depending on the size of what you're trying to do, you might have somebody wear multiple hats. That's absolutely fine, but it's just about roles and responsibilities. And eventually what could happen, and I'm going to say could very loosely, is that could expand out across the platform, right? Because essentially a lot of these processes can be repeated. So we'll cover that in a bit, but it's just to say this is the kind of high level structure you want to be thinking about where possible. So I mentioned testing earlier, functionality testing and user experience testing. The key objective here, as I said earlier, is to make sure that it functionally works fine. So if it's built in English, make it work, test it. Does the catalog load, for example? Can I interact with all of the choices? Does it actually create the target record that I'm after? Or does the menu open? All those kinds of things. If it works, then that's one less thing to worry about in terms of testing and noise, right? You don't want to create unnecessary retests. Whereas when it comes to the user experience side of things, if we've added French and German and Japanese as an example, as long as those specialists, those language testers can go in and say, yep, I understand what I'm doing and I can see where I need to interact and it makes sense, then that's the win, right? Because it's all about, is it usable? Usability is the biggest item that we want to try and get for. Is it usable? And it can always be improved. Let's not beat around that bush. Everything can always be improved, but the key question all the time is it usable? Okay, so we're going to get into some of the technical side of things. We're going to touch on a few of those, and it's going to get a little bit interesting, shall we say, but here we go. Let's go with this. So to make this work, there are some scripting best practices and some instance governance best practices that should be followed. Um, we'll go into some of the key scripting ones in a bit, but we have some references here. I'm not going to go too much into it, but the idea here is to say, as long as coding standards are followed and certain standards specifically, then it will make things a lot easier in the long run. So one of them being in any scripts that you define, server-side, client-side, or any portal widgets, anything along those lines, you need to call the message API if you've got some presentable messages that you want to present. And we'll talk about that and I'll show that as well in a bit. Okay, so we need to go through some tables and how translations on a UI level technically work within the platform itself. So outside of the language table is going to essentially define that language for you. When you install one of our 22 language packs, it will create the 22 records for you. It will define how they are, whether they're left to right and so on and so forth, and it will give you the IDs. We follow what's called the ISO 639-1 code, or standard, I should say. So if you needed to create a new one, you can. There's methods and there's processes to do that, but essentially this is where that bit is defined. And then if you needed to add your own extra language, so let's say Vietnamese, for example, you'd also need to make a choice in the user preferred language field as well, which is detailed down here, because then they can actually select that given language. So once we have our language defined, we have 5 tables in the UI level that we need to think about. First one being the sysui message table. This is for all scripted messages. So you can imagine something like an alert or a confirm or an info message or a field level message, something like that. You can have the sys choice table. This is the same table that you use for English choices. It has an extra language column on it, and this is for drop-down choices. You have sys documentation, the same one that you would use for English field labels. You use it for other labels as well because it has a language ID on it. So if I create a field label in English, I can in the same place create one in French or German or any other language I so choose. And then you have sys translated for translatable fields and sys translated text for translatable HTML or translatable text values itself. And they're governed by the field types as well. So we'll talk through how each of those quickly work. The sysui message table, quite simply put, if there is a call to the message API, the key acts as a unique identifier for that given message in that given language, and then it can actually represent it. So very high level, we have versions that are bad. We don't want to do this. This is that coding standards that I was referring to. We need to make sure that these hard-coded strings, you'll hear me mention that later, hard-coded strings are not so great. They need to be called in this way. So if we want to add an info message, that's fine. This is a server-side one because it says GS. We need to make sure we're calling the message API and we're passing in the key that we want to call. This is an example of a record. We can see we've got that record in English and in French. And in English, the message is this is a test message, and in French, it says it here. So the idea here is great because if I, as a process owner, want to change any of that sentence, I don't need to go and edit the code. I edit the record, including the English one, right? As long as the key is kept and I maintain that, if I'm a process owner, I say, actually, I don't want it to say this is a test message anymore. I want it to say something else. Then instead of going to edit the code, as I say, we can just edit the message record itself. And it can be repurposed and reused as many times as we want. But the idea as well is to say that there are different ways to call the message API. So as I said, in server-side scripts, it's gs.getMessage. In client-side scripts, it's getMessage, and you can see that here. And in the UI pages, there are versions with the $brace, depending on the scenarios, and you can see in a widget, it would also be $brace as well. But we have this all documented, so don't worry too much about that. We've got some more material. So sys choice for choices, exactly the same as English, is defined for the table and the field, the sequence, the value, and therefore the language. So you can see I've got some English choices here. This is from the state field on the incident table. And if I was to add the French values, it's exactly the same. So as long as the value of this French label that we can see here matches the correct sequence order of the values that we have, then it's nice and easy. We don't have any specialist things that we need to do. We just need to make sure that the server-side value and the labels correlate to what we're after. And as long as they're populated, we're basically duplicating those records per language. And if we go into the field labels for sys documentation, it works in a very similar way. So we can see here on a task, I have that same state field because it's an inherited field on the incident table. I have the label in English. The label says state, the plural says states, and in French we have état and état. And if we wanted to have a help and a hint, we could also define them in the same way as well. And for sys-translated text, it works a little bit differently. And the reason I've called this one out first is because it has a unique field called a document field. So This doesn't have an English baseline, but what we can see here is the field that we want to instantiate a translation for is governed by the fact that it's a translated text field for the SC cat item. So the way that it works is if we find that original English record, we can see developer, laptop, Mac here, this is in the SC cat item table, then in the translated text table, we're going to put the sysid of that record there. We're going to say we want the name field, which is essentially this one here, and we want to translate that so you can see all the translations here. There's no need to put the English in there because the English is already part of the source table, but we can see all the other languages that we've got here, and it's governed by that. So we can say this table, this field, go and replace it on that sysid. And then we have sys-translated, which works a little bit similar, but without the document sysid value. So we can say again, governed by the fact that it's a translated field, here's the original source label, and then we can see the translations underneath. And if you notice, we're going to question rather than the variable set item option new table, because that field is actually defined on the table above it in terms of hierarchy. So we need to go to that table above it rather than the item option new table. So just an example. So the reason I did it in that order is because then we can go through the architecture of a catalog item. And just very simply put, this is one catalog item with one variable on it, and these are the kinds of records that you would need for those translations. So don't worry too much about making notes right now. It's just to say there is a way, there is a strategy, and we have it all documented for you if you need to. So just very, very quickly, before we go on to the next section, we have the sysUI message table for scripted messages. We have the syschoice table for drop-down choices. We have the sysdocumentation table for field labels. We have systranslated for other things like report names, the widgets, the catalog item titles, things like that. And we have sys-translated text for the descriptions of widgets and reports and variables and catalog items and their descriptions as well. And this covers multiple UIs, as you can see at the bottom. So I'm just going to pause again because that's quite an interesting topic. I just want to make sure that we haven't got any other questions.
No questions so far.
Awesome. Okay, so then we can start thinking about other considerations. So how do we want to localize an email? Okay, so the easiest way to do it at the moment, because we also have to think about, could the content itself be different for different audiences? If that was the case, then we can essentially just duplicate the email that we have. So in this example, I've got incident open for me on the incident table. I can duplicate that as an English one and a Japanese one in this example, right? So the Japanese one would have a trigger, additional trigger that says caller.language is Japanese, and the English one would say caller.language is English. And then that allows me to have a unique header for the Japanese one, a unique footer for the Japanese one, a different HTML template if I need to, and it can call the mail scripts if we need to. Now, I'm not going to go too much in the technicals, but think of the process considerations. So it's good to do it in that way because, yes, we will PDF it. It's good to do it in that way because that allows you to have different contact details, for example, if it needed to go to a different audience, if you needed to. Okay, and then another consideration that we can think about is chats, the chat that you have on a portal, right? So we can create different chat groups. So we can say, all right, if we have a queue that is based for one region, they're set to one schedule, that's absolutely fine. We can take that one step further and we can present different chat queues. It could be based on a locale, it could be based on a language, it could be based on a location. It's completely up to you. And then they can be presented as separate links within the portal and they can be going to whoever they need to go to. And people can even be members of more than one if they're that technically capable of speaking more than one language, because I know I can't, but imagine if people could, then they absolutely could be a member of those queues if you needed them to. So in some scenarios, you can go so far as to say, okay, we want to have it broken out into language and country at the same time. That's absolutely fine. It just means more queues, and you just have people that are in as members for that. So that's fine. Okay, so before we go into some of the knowledge stuff, because that's going to be quite a chunky piece, we're going to go through some of the important properties while we're still talking about the UI. Within system localization application, so you go to system properties and system localization, you'll be presented with a page that is essentially a properties page that looks like this. And if you wanted to find out if anything that you've built is externalized, so that's where it shows one of the prefixes, we'll talk about the prefixes in a second, there's a property that you can turn on temporarily. It's this one here. It's called displays translation prefix on translatable strings. And what will happen is the page that you're on, and it will apply to all users on the instance at a time. So please remember to turn it off because otherwise everyone's going to see it. you'll see something like this. Now, I appreciate the text might be a bit small, but you can see here we have a prefix, okay? And the idea is to tell you, wherever you're looking in the UI, one of the 5 prefixes, which are detailed here on the side, what table the translation records should sit in. Now, this will only happen if the actual string or a sentence or a piece of text in the UI is externalized. So if the system understands, because it's been following coding standards and established ways of doing things, you should have a prefix. If you don't have a prefix, then that would imply that you need to have a look at whatever it is. So my example of calling the get message API, if you've got a widget that doesn't call the get message API, then that would obviously be a challenge. So you'd need to have a quick look at that code, see if that needs to be corrected, then you can make your English record, and it'll be an MSG, for example. So that will go into the SysUI message table. So you can see here, we've got all these different prefixes. Oh, if I just go back a second. We have all these different prefixes all over the place, along the headers, along the menu items, even in the search box, the announcement widget title, the video widget title, and so on and so forth. And that will apply across the whole UI. So if you needed to do a quick test as part of your UX testing, you absolutely can use that feature. That's what it's for. Okay, cool. So I will now have a look at the global side of knowledge bases. And sorry if we're going fast, I'm just very conscious of time. So when it comes to knowledge bases, there's a couple of key decisions and thoughts about what you can do. So it's not to say this is a hard and fast rule. It's just to say, think of the considerations and think from what we're going to talk about, what would work best for you. It's not to say that this is the only way. There's many ways. It's not to say that you can't do it a different way. And it's also not to say that if you've gone live already in a particular way that you can't change it. You can if you want to, but you don't have to. So what I want you to think about is what meets your business needs and what is the least amount of admin overhead for your particular needs. So we're going to go through 2 use cases. We're going to flesh them out and discuss them and do a pro and con at the end of it. So the first thing when we do a global knowledge base is we need to think about who the audience is. Who is it for in that context, right? And is the content that we're going to present in the knowledge base relevant for the entire world? And if it is relevant for the entire world, are there any specifics such as, I don't know, a policy for a given region? You might have that in the HR side of things. Does it have any changes that need to be made, right? And there are different ways. So all of what we're going to talk about can be applied at the KB level, and it can even be applied at the knowledge article level if needed, and it can even be applied through knowledge blocks if needed. Okay, so it all depends on your needs, but these are the 3 key questions I always try and think about when we do a global knowledge base. So let's go through the first use case. All content is relevant for everybody. So let's have a look at the 3 questions. If all of our internal or external customers and our employees and end users need to consume all of that available content, sure. Agents and fulfillers will operate in English. Okay, that's fine. That makes sense. All of the content is relevant for the entirety of the organization or entirety of our audience base. Doesn't matter where they are. And there's no specific locational needs. And because there's content that would be the same no matter of the location, there are no locale variational needs. What can we do? Well, in theory, we could design one knowledge base, okay? And for those who don't know, knowledge articles are really nice and interesting because they work in a parent-child relationship. So if we have an English article, that can act as our parent, and there's actually another field on the article table itself called parent. It's in the top right-hand corner. And when you create a translated version of that given article, it will populate, or you should populate, that particular parent field with the sys-ID of the source. Now, there's no technical reason that it has to be English as the parent article. It's just to say in this example, we've started with English. So if I wanted to create a Spanish article, that's fine. If I want to create an Italian one, that's also fine. They'll have unique knowledge article numbers, so they can be referenced in their own right, and they can also run the workflow in their own way as well. So think of it like this. If I have the English one that has its own publication workflow, the Spanish one can follow it, or you can tell it to go a different way. That's entirely your choice. Maybe you have an extra approval. That's up to you. Or the Italian one can also have a different one. Maybe you needed to go for a language SME. That's absolutely fine. Out of the box, though, there is no logic that says just because I've decommissioned the English article, does it also decommission the Spanish and Italian? That's up to you guys, right? So going back to our building blocks analogy, the platform has the capabilities and the tools to do that, but we can't funnel everybody into one particular way because what might work for one customer may not necessarily work for another. So if your process suggests that you should, say, okay, we're going to retire this English article. Do we also want to retire the others? You can absolutely extend that with a business rule or something to that effect. That's absolutely fine. So let's look at a hybrid scenario. If we have some content that's relevant for everyone and some specific to a given region or locale, looking at those three questions, the audience is all customers and employees. End users will consume all available content that is relevant. We have globally relevant content that some is for the entirety of the organization and some is relevant to a specific locale or region. So let's have a look where some of these have specific needs. Again, this is just a high-level scenario. It's not to say it's a specific scenario. So in this one, we can say, okay, we can have a global knowledge base. Everybody in the world can have access to that. Okay. We have a North American continent knowledge base as well. So everyone in North America, so I wouldn't have access to that because I'm based in Europe and the UK. And then we can also have a Canadian knowledge base, right? So in theory, we're saying 3 knowledge bases. So this would mean myself would only have access to the global knowledge base. Alison and the rest of the team would have access to North American and the global content knowledge base. And anyone who sits in Canada would have access to all 3. Okay. And the reason we can do that is through user criteria at the knowledge base level rather than the actual article level if we want to do that. So that would look like this. So we have, imagine this is Alison, she has access to the global KB and the North American KB, fantastic. She can potentially see the English articles, the Spanish articles, the Italian articles in that particular knowledge base. And in the North American one, the English, the Spanish and the French KB, if she wanted to, that's absolutely fine. But then someone in Canada would have access to all 3. And that's because they're being evaluated, as I say, at the actual KB level. As I said, it's not to say you have to do this, it's just to say think of the admin overheads, because if they're not actually at the article level with all of those criteria, then if they're at the knowledge base level, all the articles will by default inherit those permissions. And it means it puts less pressure on your publication process and less testing if necessary. So just food for thought and consideration. So the other thing we can also do, now that we know we can have global knowledge bases and now that we know that we can have translated articles, is that we can use a feature in knowledge management called translation management, which allows us to review the English source article, which will be shown on the left in a nice comparison UI, and then we can translate it on the right. Okay, so this is the UI 16 view. I appreciate the image is a bit small, but I can show you a demo of that later if we have enough time. But the idea here is to say, if I needed a quick pass in French, I could send that to Google or Azure or Watson to translate it for me. If you have the Spoke and you have the integration hub set up, there's a button here that says machine translate. It will go and do that first pass, and then you can do the create draft article and publish it as you need, right? And also this functionality is available for agents, right? So if you have the need for an agent to write a quick workaround or anything along those lines, then they can, and it can be translated quickly in that particular way. And it's also available in Workspace as well. So this is the same functionality, just being used through Workspace. Okay, so the other thing that we also need to think about when it comes to knowledge bases is the end users, whoever that audience is, they don't necessarily need to know or understand the knowledge base's taxonomy, right? They just need to be able to find what they're looking for. So one thing I always like to think about is building a knowledge base for its search rather than having to navigate through taxonomies. So what we can do is there's a whole bunch of functionalities that we can leverage even before we upgrade to AI search, for example. So as long as we're building for the search and I can enter a term and I can get results from knowledge base A and I can get results from knowledge base B, if that's relevant for me, that's fine. There's a functionality that we can leverage called the meta field. Okay, and I'll get to that in a second. But what we can do if we have that access in the right way is we can say, okay, I can filter things by languages if I use something like the KB portal, which has the more advanced widgets, and we can talk through that. So if we have that meta field working, we can start putting in synonyms, typos, other phrases within it to make it easier, okay? So if you notice in this image, I have the word spam pick up in bold because the way that the non-AI search, so Zing, works is it looks at the title of the article, it looks at the body, and then it looks at the actual meta values. And all it needs to be is a comma-separated list. So it's not to say that you have to change anything that you're doing today. You absolutely don't. But if you were curious about that kind of functionality, it is there if you need it. And if you're not yet able to upgrade to AI search and you want to improve the search capabilities, you absolutely can do that quite easily and just add those meta values and you can review them as you need to. So you can see here, this Dutch example does not have spam, this German example does not have the word spam, but this French one does. So it's just to show it can work if you need it to. And this actual image that you can see here, as I say, is from the /kb portal. It should be on by default on your instances. If you navigate to your instance and do /kb, you should see the knowledge homepage. If you don't already know what it will show you a tile based on every single knowledge base that you have access to as that user, and it's got some more advanced functionalities. If you have the glide noman enable multi-language search property turned on, then you should be able to see this widget on the side. And there's also another property that will allow you to either single select a language, and this is per user, right? So this is a user preference that's generated. If you want to have more than one language available for search and filtering, you can say, okay, I just want German, I just want French, I just want Japanese. Then it will only show the articles in that language that have been created that meet those search result criteria. So going back to the slide that we looked at earlier, this is starting to make a bit more sense now, right? Because now that if we have the technology side of things, we have the language side of things, and we have the key decision makers, there's overlaps between our needs from the UI perspective, and there's overlaps for things like the content perspective, such as knowledge bases. Can the article view controlled based on the user language, as a question asked? Yes, you can do that. So if I quickly go back to here, I can show you a demo if we have enough time, but through this particular portal results page, yes, absolutely. And if you already have an existing portal, such as the previous ESC portal or the IT service portal, you can actually redirect the search results page, and we've got a docs article on how to do that to this particular search page. So I think it's called KB_search off the top of my head, and you can actually redirect them to this to do exactly that. And when you go to an internationalized knowledge article, you'll find that it has a little globe symbol in the top left, just underneath the title, and it will show you which language you're looking at, and if there's others that are available for it, because that parent-child relationship, you can click on it, it'll give you a little drop-down selection, and you can choose the other language if you need to. But if you absolutely had to restrict, say, the French one from people like me who don't speak French very well, then yeah, you could put a criteria on it if you needed to. So it's ultimately to say there's lots of flexibility if you need it. No worries. Okay, so let's have a quick review of what we are putting together, right? So like I said, it's all about user experiences. We have a portal that we've built in English and we've tested it and it works. The next step we wanted was to have it in some other languages. So let's have a look at French and Japanese as an example, right? So we have French on the left. We can see that we've translated all the menus. We can see we translated the catalog items. We can see we translated some VA topics if we wanted to. And Japanese, we can see that we've translated it into Japanese, all the catalog items. And I see the irony of my pound symbol, so that's my fault, apologies. And we can see that we have the VA topics as well. So it's to say that it is absolutely doable. You can absolutely manage this. It's all there. It just needs some careful considerations and planning, mainly around the user experience, as I keep saying. So another scenario that sometimes happens is you might have an organizational need where the IT side of the business supports their processes in English and the HR side of the business may support things in other languages. And that might be an interesting challenge at the moment, especially when we're trying to bring all of these business units together with the new ESC portal, right? So at the end of the day, that's called a mixed language experience. And you want to try and avoid a mixed language experience where possible, because it doesn't necessarily help the end users. But like we've shown, it is absolutely possible to translate all of these different user experiences. So when it comes to the development cycle, we need to think about what are the components that we're building with. Does it need to be translated, and therefore does it need to be published? And then depending on the needs of the business, it can actually be brought together, right? So if we have a look at what that actually means from the whole platform perspective, we might end up having a different area of the platform being used, right? We may have suddenly expanded out to HR when we had ITSM or vice versa. That's fine. We might have a potentially different set of languages. Do we need to bring them together? Do we need to amalgamate them into a single offering of languages? Do we need to ensure that there's consistency? Do we need to make sure that any publication pipelines of whether it's the developments, whether it's the knowledge content, all those kind of things, do they need to be brought together or amalgamated? And do we need to think about benefits between the collaboration of the different teams, right? So one of the approaches that I would say is probably best practice, because we have it within the Center of Innovation and Excellence, is the idea of bringing these teams together, because you might have IT requirements coming in, you might have HR requirements coming in, and these are just very loose examples. It could be any other department that uses the platform. Therefore, you might want to think about a global dev team, because all of the capabilities that we're talking about not only can be centralized, but they're going to be overlapping, right? So if you've got those different requirements coming in, you might have your example dev process here. So you might require do your triage of your requirements. You might prioritize whatever they are. The build solutions, they could be overlapping. Like we said, the building blocks, a field is a field, a widget is a widget. There's no need to reinvent the wheel for any of these different requirement sets. The localization processes would technically be the same, and the testing would technically be the same as well. So the idea is to say one platform team has many, many benefits in terms of consistency and in terms of cost. So going back to that slide, but with a bit more detail from earlier, we can say, okay, we have our platform ownership. That could be the steer code, that could be the owners. That's absolutely fine. We have our development team. They can be the technical side of things. That's absolutely fine. And we have our language team who can define and police how that language needs to be. So whether it's the style guides, whether it's the glossaries and terms, and making sure that it's as consistent as it can be across the platform. So hopefully, if we have our dev process and we have a governance layer on top, we can make sure that everything becomes consistent. That's the key thing. It's all about those user experiences being as consistent as possible. Are we using the right words the same everywhere? So if I go to a portal and it refers to a case, does it say that for the catalog items and the COEs? Does it say that in all the documentation? Does it say that in the mobile app? Does it say that in the back end? All those different areas. So how would we actually make that work in terms of the pipeline? Well, if we have our development cycle, we have our build milestones, whatever they are, they could be sprints, they could be any other method that you use, that's fine. We have some platform level activities, so we need to extract whatever the strings that are going to be translated, that's fine. And then we can say, okay, the actual language side of things, the actual translation activities, as soon as they're translated in the first pass, whatever the method is, they can be imported, and as soon as they're imported, they can be reviewed, right? So it doesn't have to have a blocker on anything in particular, and you can be doing the remediation straight away, right? So the idea here is to say, because there's always more being built, there's actually a concept in the localization world called continuous localization, which basically means there's always more that's being added, therefore there's always more that needs to be translated, right? So it's not a one and done scenario, because there's always more content that needs to be done, or tweaks and adjustments that need to be made. So very high level, going through the Center of Innovation Excellence idea, there's technical benefits, there's capability benefits, there's language benefits, there's translation of benefits, and obviously the user experience benefits, the big one. So there's a lot there, I appreciate. And if you need more information on that idea, we have a whole section on the CSC which talks about the Center of Innovation and Excellence. Nice link up there. And if anyone hasn't seen the CSC, this is the homepage for the CSC, and it goes through all the different persona types and how it can be having information that's relevant to you guys. So let's put that bit to one side. We now know we can do translation. We now know how the platform can do some high-level stuff. We now know that it can do interactions with other languages. We now know that it can do content in other languages, and there's ways to do all of that. What about planning for the go live? Because that's always a challenge, right? We know all the technical stuff now, but what about other factors that we haven't been talking about? Well, let's look at my team, where we're based, right? We have our own instance internally, and we have members in Tokyo, we have members in Singapore, we have members in London, such as myself, Dublin as well, and we have 2 areas in California, right? So that's 3 key continents that we need to think about, including time zones. So we have decisions that we need to make. Do we be aware of all of these American time zones? Potentially. Do we need to be aware of all of these European time zones? Potentially. And do we also need to be aware of the APJ time zones that impact our team? Potentially. And the reason being is, and this next slide is going to look very colorful, so I apologize if it comes out weird on the Zoom. But we need to think about the impact of when something goes live, right? So what might be easy for me might not necessarily be easy for someone else, depending on where they're based, right? So it's not to say there's a right or wrong answer, it's just to say it's a good idea to map out win, because you don't want to do something on Friday at 5 p.m. and for someone else it impacts them, and then you might have a problem that you need to resolve, or it might overlap into a different time zone and impact a P1 need for them. So it's just to say, plan out times for the actual go lives as well. That's also another big factor. Okay, so I think we have amazingly done it, Alison. We've actually got there.
I was going to say, I'm very impressed. That was very smooth and you got through a lot of amazing content.
So we need to open the floor to allow people to have some questions. I'm sure there's going to be some questions, and then we can do some quick demos.
Great. Yeah, we've only gotten the one question that you answered in the session earlier, so we'll open it back up. So again, as a reminder, if you're on and you have a question, please submit it in the Q&A.
So I'm just looking at the poll results as well. It looks like half of our attendees are indeed using languages other than English at the moment. Very interesting. Does anybody want to put in chat, how many languages are they using? Is it more than one? Is it more than 5? Or is it more than 10? And you can DM me directly if you don't want to share. Interesting. 12. More than 10. Oh, here we go. Got some questions. Is there a roadmap of when more functionality will be supported for translations, life cycles? That is a good question. So it depends on what you define as more functionality to do with the life cycles, because there's two parts to that question. There's the idea of being represented visually in other languages. That should already be there. But then there's also the idea of building specific checklist items. I thought that's what you meant. Yeah. So at the moment, that would mean you'd have to create a different one per country, if that makes sense, because it's not to do with the actual language side of it. It's to say, for this location, they have their own checklist. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so can the article view controlled? Yeah, we've done that one. So up to 12, more than 10, 13. Wow, these are a lot. Campaign items as well. Yeah, I'll tell you what, I will find out on the latest for that one for you. Are we planning to bring in more language like Arabic? Oh, that is a good question. Unfortunately, I can't answer that one today, but I can say that you're not the first person to ask it. That's unfortunately the best answer I can give. Yeah, but thank you for asking. I will put it on my tracker because I do keep a log of all the asks. Okay, any other questions? And just in chat, if you can, is there any key areas that you want me to show at a high level in terms of a demo? So I have an instance with all the language packs installed. I have a fair few things I can show you, the knowledge base features that we're talking about where you can filter the results by language. I can show you what the interface looks like in other languages. It's completely up to you guys.
And actually, Alex, we are at time. So if we get interest, we could see how quick you can do it, or we could even get potentially another session scheduled.
Yeah, and we can do deep dives as well if you want. That's absolutely fine. Okay, can we show the parent field for a knowledge article? Absolutely, we can. Right, bear with me 2 seconds. Right, let's see if I'm still logged into this instance. I think I am. Yes. Okay, so let's go to the knowledge table. And let's go to my spam example, right? Because that's always a good one. So this is the English article down here. What is spam? This is how I built those screenshots. We have its own number because it's English. It's in the email category, it's in the IT knowledge base, and you can do this with knowledge blocks as well. It works exactly the same way. But the actual logic of the translations is ever so slightly different with knowledge blocks. But we can see the parent field here, right? So because this is the actual, think of it as the top of a pyramid, it doesn't have a parent because always it'll be the parent of itself. So that doesn't make much sense. So if we scroll down, we can see that we have some open translation tasks, right? Or they were open, they're now closed. One for Japanese, one for Hebrew, that's fine. We can see we've got article versions, that's also fine. But we have this related list here, translated versions, and it shows 11. So let's have a look at that. So each translation, right, you can see German 3 times, has its own, and it's governed by its own version number, right? So if I go to 3.0, that would suggest it's the latest version. So if I go in here, we can see that that parent field is populated with the English article. So when the eye loads, we can see there is that English article that we created. Okay. So if I go back, I can see the translation in German. That's fine. It lives its own article's life, right? We can still see the translated versions, but in terms of its own process and in terms of its own publication flow, it's its own entity. Think of it as literally that. It can have its own valid date. It can have its own published time. That's absolutely fine. So you can go one step further. I talked about the idea of translation management. If I go to the knowledge base level, what we can do is we can define some predetermined languages for that knowledge base. Okay, and if I go to this knowledge base level, the IT one, you can see I've got some extra fields, right? So if I've got, I think it's the knowledge management V2 plugin turned on for internationalization, you'll see we have a language field and we also have auto create translation tasks. Now, translation tasks can be manually created, right, whenever you want. That's absolutely fine. But if we want to make things a little bit easier, we can literally plug in some of the languages that we want these translations to be in for these articles. And when this is ticked, every time we've published a new source article, English in our example, it will go and create a task for each one of these languages, right? To say, hey, I want to go and translate that into another language. So if we go back a second, see if I can find one that's in flight. Go back to the English article. And I'll show you what that comparison UI looks like. We may not be able to do it because these are closed. So yeah, let's have a. So I've gone to translation management. I have it here. We'll go to open tasks. And you can see there's a mapping functionality. So we can say we need this language article to go to this person or this approver. So let's go to this particular task here because it says it's work in progress. I have a task record, looks like any other form, right? It's telling me it's from the source language. It's telling me it's going to this target language. That's fine. It can be assigned to whoever we need it to. That's absolutely fine. And you can see this translate feature, this translate UI action up here. So this functionality has been around a fair few releases now. But if I click on this translate button, you can see that we have the English on the left and we have the target language on the right. So I've manually put ZH just to show that it is the content. It would normally be written in the language of Chinese, but I don't speak Chinese, so unfortunately you have to put my ZH in front of the English. But if I'm happy with whatever that's come back as, I can click create draft article. It will go and instantiate that creation for us, and then it can go and follow its own publication process. Okay. Now, while we're on the topic of this comparison UI, in Quebec, we actually launched a new functionality called the localization framework. And I mentioned earlier that we have the architectural side of things of how a catalog item is translated. I'm going to show you something else. What if we wanted to request translations for a catalog item, right? Let's see if this works. So I'm going to find something with some variables. So let's do 401k. This is just from demo data. So let's see what happens. Does this have some variables? It does. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to request translations for this. So this is with the localization framework, which, as I say, is a functionality that came out in Quebec and it's been expanded in Rome. You can turn it on if you don't already have it. And now what it's asking us is, do we want to translate into languages that we've configured? Now, I have all of the language packs turned on, but I've only configured the localization framework to work in these 4 languages, right? And it's already checked to see that I have translations done and performed for this particular catalog item. But well, it's a record producer, but let's try it anyway, right? Let's put it into Japanese, and just for the sake of a demo, let's see what happens. So we've now been told that we have a task that's been generated because I made this record producer. I'm the developer. I just need to make sure that it gets translated. I don't need to actually do the translation, so it can be assigned to someone, right? So if we go into localization framework, we go to the tasks, and just for the sake of the demo, I'm just going to tweak the breadcrumbs. and remove myself from the breadcrumb. Here it is, right? Record producer, 401k, plan enrollment, English to Japanese. So let's have a quick look at that. Again, we have a nice task. We can see the source languages to English, the target language to Japanese. Maybe we need some approvers in there. That's up to us. There's some predetermined workflows. You can pick whatever is necessary for you guys. You can define the translation fulfillers. That's also fine. But what happens if we click this translate UI action? We now have a full comparison UI, right? We can see all of the components that make up that catalog item on the left. We can see the name, the short description, the question in the variables, the other question in the variables, potentially the instruction set, the help tag, and we can see the translations on the right. Now, it told us that the translations already existed, so that's okay. I don't need to do anything. That's why they grayed out. And there's a padlock to protect us from making a mistake. If the translations didn't exist, they'd be blank. Did you say this was Rome or Vermont? It's in Quebec. This actual catalog item one is an artifact that is in Quebec. So you can turn it on right now. And if you have Integration Hub or a Pro SKU and you have a subscription to Google or Microsoft or IBM Watson, then you can MT these actual items through that, right? You can see up here we have machine translate. Now I don't have the spoke on this particular instance, but if I did and I clicked it and none of these were grayed out, it could do those strings for me and it could actually present them for me, right? And then you can have your publication process, have someone review it if you needed to. Now the other thing, like I said earlier, is you can get really mature in terms of your processes and send it to what's called a TMS. A TMS is a translation management system. So that's the idea of saying, okay, we have our own translation capability in-house. We have our own MT and it takes into account those style guides that I mentioned. It takes into account those glossaries and terms and you can manage the actual phrasing. And they have a particular file format called XLIF. Think of it as basically a particular type of XML. But the idea here is to say, okay, we can send it via an integration to there, or we can export it manually if we needed to, giving you flexibility, or you can send it via email to an agency if that's what you have. And obviously you can import it if necessary. But the point here is to say, if you really wanted to go that far, you can using the localization framework. Now, the idea of the framework was it's extensible, right? You can add more to it. So in Quebec, you can do catalog items, which also cover record producers. And you can also do, let me have a look. This is on the Rome patch for VA topics, and I'll talk through what we have here as well. So VA topics, you can translate the structured VA topic. So if you're in the VA topic table for SysCS topic, you can say, okay, if I have a structured VA conversation where it says, I ask a question, present option A, B, or C, those are structured conversations, right? You're not expecting free text responses. So to translate those, essentially, is just SysUI message records. But you could extend it even further, okay? So in Rome, I'm going to go through some of the ones that you can see here. I've put protos because they're ones that I'm prototyping for you guys. So Quebec came with catalog items. Rome came with document template block content. It also came with HTML document template, and it also came with NLU models. So these ones up here are Rome. What you can do, because it's an extensible API, is you can add ones. So if you want, I can add a link in chat in a bit, which talks about an announcement, because I posted about that on the community the other week to show how you could do a portal announcement using this capability. You can also extend it to do assessments if you want, and you can see that I'm attempting to do forms. Now, this isn't with any special trickery. This is just as a normal developer on the platform using the publicly available information in terms of the API. And you can also see that I'm trying to do portals. So without revealing too much, because we might, release that in the future, let's have a look and see what that might look like if we were to try and do something like a portal. So in my particular example, I've got it to go and identify all the pages in a portal, all of the widgets in the portal, and all of the page route maps that contain widgets, right? So let's have a look. If I go to the service portal for Employee Service Center, I did a request, just like we did before. We have a task, I hit translate, what's it going to find? So here we go, we've got the menus, we've got the org chart if we want it to, we've got the widgets, and the translation's only there because it's demo data. So it's to show that we already do that. So it's not to say that this is a functionality in its own right. It's to say that if you have a need of something that you want to translate, you can define your own artifact scripts, should you want to, and should you need to. So we can give you all the information about that. That's absolutely fine. But you can see here that it can identify the strings and you can populate the translations, which means you don't need to do spreadsheets and all of those kind of things. You can track them in here if you needed to, which means it's a lot less technical. So any questions? Well, I think we're good on time, which is quite amazing because I was a bit worried we wouldn't be.
think we're caught up. Thank you. This was awesome. I'm really glad that we could have you on as a guest speaker. I also want to do another plug for the community forum that you own. I know you talked about that at the beginning, but I just want everyone to know that Alex, as we can see, has a lot of knowledge on this topic, and he has been posting lots of blogs and articles that are very, very helpful. So just want to draw attention to that as well before we close out.
I will get you those in 2 seconds. So thank you for that. It is here. All right. I'm going to put that for everybody in the webinar chat. There you go. So I'm just going to look at this other question. Getting an error on the first link. Oh, is that the post about the content that's upcoming? Okay.
Okay, we can look into that to see if that is an issue on the community side or what's going on with that.
I think we're okay right now.
Great. Well, thank you again, Alex. Thanks for the session. Like Lisa posted in the chat, the recording is up on YouTube. We've been streaming live this entire time. So if you want to go back and watch anything, that will be posted. Thank you, everyone.